I want you to picture something for me. You're standing in the middle of a condominium that you've lived in for 19 years, and every wall has a nail hole where something used to hang, and every room has a slightly lighter patch on the carpet where a piece of furniture sat for so long it left a ghost of itself behind. And you are 63 years old, and you are looking at all of that and thinking, quietly, clearly, with a certainty that surprised you the first time it arrived and hasn't left since, that you are done. Not done in the way that sounds sad, done in the way that sounds like a decision. Done the way a door sounds when someone finally closes it properly instead of just leaving it ajar for years out of habit. That's where this started for me. Not in a crisis, not in a collapse, just in a very ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a condo in Sacramento with nail holes in the walls and a thought that had stopped being a fantasy and started being a plan. If that sounds like the beginning of something you want to hear the rest of, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's more where this came from, and I think you'll want to be around for it. My name is Margaret. Most people have called me Maggie since grade school, and I've never fought it, so Maggie works fine here too. I am 67 years old. I am a former high school English teacher, 31 years in the Sacramento Unified School District, the last 12 of them at the same campus where I'd started, a mid-sized public school on the east side of the city where the student population shifted about 3 times over the course of my career, and the building's boiler broke down every single winter like it had the thing scheduled. I retired at 62. I sold my condo at 63. I moved to Palawan in the Philippines 4 years ago, and I have not once, in 4 years, woken up in the morning and wished I hadn't. I want to be accurate about that last sentence because I don't believe in selling a story by ironing out all the parts that didn't go smoothly. There have been mornings where I woke up and missed Sacramento specifically, not in a deep, aching way, but in the small, precise way you miss the familiarity of any place you spent 2 decades becoming fluent in. The particular coffee shop on J Street where the barista knew my order, the Saturday farmers market, the school hallways that smelled like industrial cleaner and printer ink and whatever the cafeteria had going that day. I miss those things, the way you miss a song you haven't heard in a while, warmly, without urgency, without any actual desire to go back to it. That's the distinction that matters. Missing and wanting are not the same thing, and I figured that out somewhere in my first year here, and it made everything easier once I did. Let me tell you how the thought actually became a plan, because I think that part matters more than people realize. It wasn't a single moment. It was an accumulation of smaller ones that finally tipped over into a conclusion I couldn't argue my way back out of. The first one happened about 3 years before I actually retired, when I was sitting in a district-wide professional development session on a Saturday in February, which is already a sentence that contains its own argument. And the facilitator was walking us through a slide deck about student engagement metrics that I'd seen, in one form or another, at least 9 times in my career, and I looked around the room at colleagues I'd known for years, and something occurred to me with perfect, almost rude clarity. I was going through the motions of a thing that had once genuinely animated me, and I wasn't sure exactly when that had changed, but it had, and I was tired in a way that a long weekend wasn't going to fix anymore. I didn't retire that week, or even that year. I stayed another 3 years, partly because I still cared about the students, genuinely, even when the institution exhausted me, and partly because the pension calculation rewarded staying, and I'd spent enough years teaching other people's children about compound interest to understand when the math was worth respecting. But I started thinking differently about what came after, which is a thing I suspect a lot of teachers do eventually. You spend 30 years organizing your entire life around an academic calendar. Your vacations are summer and winter break. Your weekends are grading. Your evenings are lesson planning. And then one day, you realize you've never actually thought about what your life looks like when none of those structures exist anymore. I started thinking about it. I thought about it for 3 years. What I thought about specifically was that I did not want to retire into smallness. That sounds abstract, so let me make it concrete. When I pictured retirement in Sacramento, what I pictured was a smaller version of the life I was already living. Fewer places to be, fewer people depending on me for anything, a calendar that shrank rather than shifted. I had friends in the city, good ones, women I'd known since my 20s, who were mostly still working and would be for years yet. And I knew that the shape of our friendships would change when I was retired, and they weren't, and that the city itself would feel different when I wasn't moving through it with a daily purpose. I wasn't afraid of that exactly. I just found, the more I turned it over, that I didn't want it. I wanted the second half of my life, the part after the 31 years of seventh period essays and parent-teacher conferences and hallway supervision in January cold, to be something that didn't look like a reduced version of what came before. I had been to the Philippines once, briefly, at 58, on a group tour that stopped in Manila and Cebu for about 10 days, and I'd experienced it the way most short tourists do, surface level, beautiful, overwhelming, slightly too fast to let any of it actually settle. But I came home with an impression that stayed with me longer than most travel impressions do. Something about the quality of the light, and the way people moved through their days, and the particular warmth of the interactions I'd had with strangers there. Conversations that felt more genuinely curious and less transactional than what I was used to. That impression sat in the back of my mind for 5 years, not urgent, not ignored, just quietly present, the way certain things are when they're waiting for the right moment to become relevant. The right moment, as it turned out, was a Tuesday afternoon about 8 months before I officially retired, when I was sitting in my condo, looking at a retirement savings spreadsheet I'd been updating quarterly for years, trying to calculate how my pension and my savings would translate into a Sacramento life, and the numbers told a story I didn't love. Not a crisis story, I wasn't broke, not even close, but a constrained story, a story where every significant decision, whether to fix the car, or take a trip, or replace the aging appliances, required a calculation rather than a choice. I was not willing to spend 20 or 25 years making that calculation every single month. And then, almost idly, just to see, I opened a browser window and typed in the cost of living in the Philippines, and the numbers were so different from what I'd been staring at for the last 20 minutes that I actually laughed out loud, alone in my condo, at a spreadsheet. I spent the next 6 months reading everything I could find, not just the bright, enthusiastic expat blogs, though I read those too, but the honest, complicated ones, the forums where people talked about what went wrong, what surprised them, what they wished someone had told them before they went. I read about the healthcare system, carefully and specifically, because I was 59 going on 60, and I was not naive about the fact that the second half of your 60s is when the body starts presenting its invoices for everything it was willing to carry quietly in the first half. I read about the visa options for long-term foreign residents. I read property laws and lease laws and the specific legal landscape for a foreign woman living alone in a country she'd visited once for 10 days at 58 years old. I made a list of every concern I had, and I mean every single one, not just the obvious practical ones, but the smaller, more personal ones too. Whether I would be lonely, whether the language gap would eventually exhaust me, whether the heat would be more than I could comfortably manage, whether being a woman alone, an older American woman alone, would put me in any kind of vulnerable position I wasn't equipped to handle. I wrote all of it down, and then I spent 3 months working through the list methodically, the way I used to ask my students to work through a research question, looking for actual evidence rather than just reassurance, finding people who'd done versions of this, and talking to them directly when I could, not just reading what they'd posted publicly, but emailing them, asking the specific questions the blog posts didn't answer. One of the women I found through an expat forum was named Constance, a retired nurse from Oregon who'd been living in El Nido in Palawan for 3 years at the time I first wrote to her. She wrote back within 2 days, which told me something about her already, and her email was long and honest and organized in the way that told me immediately she'd been a nurse for a long time. someone trained to give accurate information to people who needed it, rather than comfortable information to people who wanted it. She told me about the heat and didn't understate it. She told me about the rainy season and didn't understate that either. She told me about internet reliability and the particular frustrations of navigating bureaucracy in a country where systems work differently than what most Americans are wired to expect. And she told me all of that before she told me that she had, despite every single one of those things, absolutely no intention of ever going back to Oregon. Constance became the closest thing I had to a mentor through the planning process, answering my follow-up emails patiently, talking me through specific practicalities, recommending the areas of Palawan worth considering, and explaining why El Nido specifically had suited her in ways that Coron or Puerto Princesa might not have suited me. She is, I should say, because we're still in regular contact 4 years later, one of those people who shows up in your life at exactly the moment you needed someone specific, and turns out to be exactly the specific kind of person you needed. I've told her that directly, more than once. She always deflects it with a joke and changes the subject, which is probably the most characteristic nurse response imaginable. I went back to the Philippines for a proper scouting trip, about 14 months before I ultimately moved. Not a tour, not a group, just me, a carry-on bag, a 3-week itinerary I'd built myself, and a specific list of places I wanted to spend actual time in, rather than photograph from a van window. I spent 4 days in Puerto Princesa, which is the capital of Palawan province, getting a feel for how daily logistics worked, visiting the public markets, using the local transportation, eating at the small neighborhood places rather than the restaurants near the tourist hotels. Then I rented a small room in a guest house in El Nido for 10 days and did the same thing there, but more slowly, more deliberately letting myself get a little lost, deliberately eating whatever was available at whatever place was nearby, deliberately sitting in the same small cafe every morning for 9 of those 10 days to see whether the place felt different after repetition than it had on first contact. It felt better. That's what I was looking for, actually, whether familiarity improved a place or diminished it. Some places are like that. They're best experienced as a stranger before the novelty wears off and what's underneath shows through. El Nido felt, to me, like a place that got better the longer you stayed still inside it. The quality of the light off the limestone cliffs in the early morning, the way the town itself had a rhythm that didn't require you to participate in it at any particular pace. The people, specifically, the people I kept running into at the same cafe and the same market stalls as the days went on, who started nodding first and then saying good morning, and then, by the end of the first week, asking questions the way you ask questions of someone you expect to keep seeing, rather than someone you're politely acknowledging before they disappear back into tourist traffic. On my 9th morning at that cafe, the woman who ran it, whose name I eventually learned was Marites, set down my coffee and then sat across from me, uninvited, completely unself-conscious about the uninvited part, and asked me directly whether I was thinking about staying. Not visiting, staying. She said she could always tell the difference between tourists looking at the town and people looking at it the way you look at something you're trying to decide whether it fits your life. I told her honestly that I wasn't sure yet. She nodded, refilled my coffee without asking, and said, in the tone of someone delivering a reasonable verdict, that she thought I should stay, because the town needed more people who sat still in it for long enough to actually see it. Then she got up and went back to work, like that was a completely ordinary thing to say to a stranger, which, I have since learned, is completely consistent with who Marites is. I flew home from that scouting trip with a decision that had stopped being a question and started being a timeline. I gave myself 1 year to get everything properly in order, and I meant properly, not approximately. I spent 4 months working with an attorney who specialized in expat property and visa arrangements to understand exactly what I could and couldn't do legally as a foreign national living long-term in the Philippines. I applied for a retiree visa through the official program, the Special Resident Retirees Visa, which allows foreign nationals of retirement age to live in the Philippines on a long-term renewable basis in exchange for maintaining a required time deposit at a Philippine bank. The paperwork was extensive, and the process was slower than I would have liked, but Constance had warned me about both of those things, and so I'd budgeted extra time into my timeline accordingly. I found an international health insurance plan specifically designed for retirees living abroad, one that covered hospitalization and emergency evacuation, because I was not going to be the person who had made a brave and thoughtful decision and then left one critical practical piece unaddressed. I knew, with full clarity, that healthcare would be the primary concern for every single person who loved me and was nervous about this, and I wanted real, specific, documented answers to every version of that question before anyone had a chance to ask it. My brother Daniel, who is 2 years older than me and lives in Portland and worries about things with the thoroughness of someone who was clearly born to be a structural engineer and became an accountant instead, told me later that the insurance documentation was the single thing that moved him from worried to something closer to grudging acceptance. He put it exactly that way. Grudging acceptance, which from Daniel is essentially a standing ovation. Telling people was its own particular project. I want to be honest about that because I think a lot of people who move somewhere unexpected spend a lot of time describing how supportive everyone was and glossing over the part where the people who loved them were, for a while at least, quite genuinely frightened. My daughter Claire, who is 38, and lives in Portland 2 miles from Daniel, was frightened. She didn't frame it as opposition, she's too self-aware for that, but I could hear it underneath every careful question she asked in the first conversation, the fear that I was doing something that would end with her too far away to do anything about it if something went wrong. I understood that fear entirely. I had sat with it myself for the better part of 18 months. I didn't dismiss it or argue it away. I just answered every question with whatever honest, specific information I actually had, and then I answered the next question, and then the one after that. My son Pete, who lives in Seattle and who has always been more comfortable with risk than Claire is, mostly asked me whether I'd actually done the research or whether I was in love with an idea. I told him to sit down because I had a lot of paper to show him, and I spent 2 hours walking him through everything: the finances, the healthcare, the legal structure, the specific logistics of how daily life actually worked, based on my scouting trip and on Constance's 3 years of first-hand data. And by the end of it, he sat back and said, "You've done this more carefully than you've done anything since you planned Mom's surprise 60th. Which was, coming from Pete, about as full-throated an endorsement as I was going to get. My mother, who is 89 and sharp as she's ever been and lives in assisted living in Sacramento, told me, when I sat down with her and explained the whole thing in detail, that I sounded like her mother had sounded when she'd decided at 64 to move from Minnesota to Arizona in the 1970s, which everyone at the time thought was slightly eccentric, and that her mother had turned out to be right. Then she told me to call her every Sunday, no matter what time it was there, and not to be stupid about the sun. She said the Philippines was hot, and I should wear a hat. That was her entire prepared response. It's possible she is the most reasonable person in my family. I sold the condo 3 months before I actually left. I want to say something honest about that part, because I've heard a lot of people describe selling their homes as purely liberating, and I don't think that's the whole truth. Or at least it wasn't the whole truth for me. It was liberating, and it was also vertiginous in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Handing over the keys to a place you've lived in for 19 years, even when you genuinely want to leave it, involves a particular kind of physical unreality, a slight dissociation from the version of yourself who unpacked boxes there and painted the spare bedroom twice because the first color was wrong, and spent 9 years grading senior essays at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings. I stood in the empty living room on the last day, just for a moment, just to mark the occasion properly, and I thought about all of it with more generosity than I'd been able to manage while I was still living inside it. Then I picked up my bag and locked the door and handed the key to the realtor, and that was that. I stayed with Claire in Portland for the 3 months between the condo sale and my departure, which was both genuinely lovely and slightly complicated in the way that staying in your adult child's house is always slightly complicated when you are a person who has lived alone for 15 years and has opinions about where things go in a kitchen. We navigated it. We've always been good at navigating things, Claire and I, since she was about 14, and figured out that I responded better to direct conversation than to careful diplomacy, which she was then, and is still now, extremely good at deploying when the situation calls for it. On my last evening in Portland, she cooked a proper dinner, and we sat at her kitchen table until almost midnight, talking about everything except the next morning's flight, which I think was both of us separately deciding that the departure itself didn't need a ceremony, that we'd already said everything that mattered before that table, and that the best thing we could do was let the evening just be an evening between two people who love each other and know it. She cried at the airport. I won't claim I didn't. I landed in Manila on a Friday afternoon, and the heat met me at the airport doors like an announcement. Not unpleasant, exactly, just definitive. I'd been warned, by Constance, by everything I'd read, by my own memory of the scouting trip, and still the first wave of it outside the terminal was its own experience. The thick, warm, tropical air that smells faintly of something I've never been able to identify precisely, something alive and green, and specific to the tropics in a way that Sacramento's dry summer heat isn't remotely similar to. I had a car arranged to take me to a hotel in the city for 2 nights before my flight down to Puerto Princesa, and I sat in the back of that car in traffic that made Sacramento's worst look like a quiet neighborhood, watching the city move outside the windows, and I felt something I wasn't entirely expecting to feel. I felt interested, genuinely, actively interested in what was outside the window, the kind of interested I hadn't felt in Sacramento in years, where I'd stopped really seeing the city because I'd long since memorized it. Everything here was unmemoized. Everything required actual attention. I sat there in traffic for 50 minutes and didn't check my phone once. Puerto Princesa was my first stop, for practical reasons. I'd arranged to spend 2 weeks there handling the final visa paperwork and the bank deposit requirements, working with a local lawyer Constance had recommended, who had helped several other foreign retirees navigate the same process, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of person I needed for that particular task: organized, specific, patient with questions, and without any apparent investment in telling me what I wanted to hear rather than what I needed to know. His name was Ronaldo Adderny. Ronaldo in the formal address, though he told me on the second meeting that Ronaldo was fine, that he'd spent enough of his career watching foreign clients twist themselves into complicated shapes, trying to be appropriately respectful, that he'd long since decided to just tell people his name at the beginning and save everyone the performance. The 2 weeks in Puerto Princesa were disorienting in a way I'd expected and organized in a way I hadn't. I'd thought of the city, before I arrived, as a way station, a bureaucratic stop before the actual destination. What I found was a city with its own distinct personality, quieter than Manila, more itself, streets that were noticeably cleaner than most Philippine cities I'd read about, a waterfront boulevard where people walked in the evenings with the unhurried ease of people who'd lived somewhere long enough to stop performing their enjoyment of it, and a public market where the fish section alone was an education in varieties I had no names for yet, and which Ronaldo, who turned out to be genuinely delighted by the market in the way some lawyers are quietly passionate about things entirely unrelated to law, walked me through one morning with the patience of a very good teacher, naming things, explaining preparations, occasionally buying something just to hand to me and say, "Try this, tell me what you think." I thought about the English classroom several times during those market mornings. Specifically, I thought about how the best learning, the kind that actually sticks, doesn't happen from a textbook, but from being placed in front of something real and actual, and having to figure out your relationship to it. 31 years of trying to get 17-year-olds to understand that a story isn't something that happens to you at a remove, but something you enter. And here I was, entering something at 63, entering it with the same combination of discomfort and aliveness that I'd spent 3 decades trying to convince teenagers was worth seeking rather than avoiding. I moved to El Nido at the end of those 2 weeks, and this is where the real story begins, which is to say, this is where the story stops being about logistics and starts being about what an actual day looks like 4 years into a life I built from a scouting trip and a spreadsheet and an honest conversation with a woman named Constance who wrote back to a stranger's email inside 2 days. I live now in a small house, a proper house rather than an apartment, which I rent from a local family who owns several properties in the area and whose grandmother, a woman named Lola Caring, lives in the main house on the same property and who initially regarded me with the cautious assessment of someone who has learned to take the long view on people before deciding what category they fall into. I don't know exactly when I passed whatever the assessment required, but I know it happened sometime in the first 3 months because the nature of our morning exchanges shifted, the way they do when you've been evaluated and found acceptable, from polite and watchful to simply present, the easy unself-consciousness of people who've decided they're stuck with each other and have made their peace with it in a way that turns out to be its own kind of warmth. My house has 2 bedrooms, a sala, which is what the living room is called, a small kitchen with a window that looks out toward a stand of coconut palms, and a back porch where I sit most mornings before the day gets properly started, with a cup of the strong local coffee I've been drinking long enough now that the idea of going back to what I used to drink in Sacramento strikes me as vaguely depressing. The rent is 8,000 pesos a month, that is, at current exchange rates, somewhere just under $145. I will let that number sit for a moment without adding anything to it, because I think it does the argument on its own. My days now have a shape that I built over time, rather than being handed, which is itself one of the things I didn't know I was going to value as much as I do. When you teach, your day has a shape imposed on it by the institution, which is both a gift and a constraint, and takes about 6 months of retirement to stop feeling like a thing you need to fill in somehow. Once I stopped trying to impose a school day structure onto my El Nido life and started just letting the structure emerge from what I actually did and who I actually spent time with, the days settled into a rhythm that is entirely my own in a way no day of my working life ever quite was. I wake up without an alarm. That sentence took me an embarrassingly long time to get comfortable writing. I spent 31 years setting an alarm for 5:50 in the morning, and the first year of retirement in Sacramento, I kept waking at 5:50 regardless, my body unwilling to trust the absence of a reason to be upright. Here, after 4 years, I wake when I wake, which is usually somewhere between 6 and 1/2 when the light comes in through the bedroom window at an angle I've learned to read by season, flatter and whiter in certain months, sharper and more golden in others. The birds here are different from California birds. I've been identifying them slowly with a field guide Constance sent me after I mentioned in an email that I kept hearing things I had no name for, and the project of learning the birds has taken longer than I expected and become something I look forward to in a way I didn't anticipate, one of those small, specific pleasures that turned out to have more weight than its size suggests. I make coffee first, always, and I take it out to the back porch while the morning is still on the cooler side of the day. El Nido sits at sea level, unlike Tagaytay, which sits up in the mountains, so the heat here is genuine tropical heat, and I was honest with myself during the planning process that this would be a significant physical adjustment for a woman who'd spent her whole life in a Northern California climate. What I found, and what I've since heard other people describe, is that the adjustment happens more completely than you expect it to. The body acclimates to its environment more thoroughly than you give it credit for when you're still looking at the thing from a distance. I am not comfortable in the same way a local person is comfortable. I don't think that ever fully happens for someone who arrived at 63, but I am not uncomfortable either. I've learned the rhythms of the heat, which hours to move around in, and which hours to let the shade do its work, and I've built a life that respects those rhythms rather than fighting them, which is perhaps the most Philippine adaptation I've made. Marites, at the cafe, has been a daily fixture of my mornings since approximately the first week. We've had 4 years of mornings at this point, which means we have had 4 years of short and then gradually longer conversations over coffee, about the town, about whatever news she considers worth relaying, about her children and her husband, and the ongoing question of whether her eldest son will stay in El Nido or eventually follow the pattern of so many young people from provincial towns and head toward the city for work. I've become, without designing it to happen, someone she talks to about her family, and she's become someone I tell things to that I might otherwise have kept inside my own head. There's a particular intimacy that grows in small, repeated daily interactions with people over years, and it's different from the intimacy of old friendship and different from the closeness of family. It's its own quiet category, and it's not nothing. It's actually, I've decided, quite a lot. I spend most mornings after the cafe, either at the market or walking, or both. The public market in El Nido is something I don't think I could have described adequately before I'd spent years inside it, and even now I'm not sure I can do it justice. It is loud and efficient and beautiful in a way that markets are beautiful when they're real markets, places where actual commerce happens between actual people rather than a performance of commerce staged for visitors. The vegetable vendors know what I cook. The fish vendor, whose name is Arnell, and who is possibly the most opinionated person I've ever met about the correct way to prepare each specific variety of fish he sells, has opinions about my cooking that he delivers unprompted and which have, over 4 years, actually made me a better cook than I was in Sacramento, which is either a testament to his instruction or a comment on how little I was challenged in my California kitchen. My neighbors are a young couple, Benji and Grace, who have 2 children, a girl named Sophia, who is now 5, and a boy named Kiko, who is 3, and who have become, in the way neighbors become family, when the geography is small enough and the walls between lives are thin enough, people I consider genuinely mine. Sophia decided sometime in her 3rd year that I was an interesting feature of her immediate world and began knocking on my door at irregular intervals to show me things: a shell she'd found, a drawing she'd completed, a fact she'd learned that she apparently judged significant enough to require sharing immediately rather than waiting for a more convenient time. I've never discouraged this. I would, if anything, have encouraged it more aggressively if I'd known at the start how much I was going to come to rely on those knocks. Grace is a school teacher, which is one of those coincidences that feels too pointed to be genuinely accidental, but which is, as far as I can tell, just coincidence. She teaches at the local elementary school, and she started asking me, somewhere in our 2nd year of neighborliness, small professional questions, the kind you ask someone when you've figured out they have relevant expertise, and you've decided the expertise outweighs whatever awkwardness might come with asking. I answered everything she asked. The conversations grew longer. She started bringing her lesson plans over, sometimes on Saturday afternoons, and we'd sit on my back porch and work through them together, her explaining the local curriculum framework and the specific challenges of her particular student population, me offering whatever I had from 31 years that seemed transferable. They are not the same contexts. Teaching English to California teenagers in a public school in Sacramento is not the same as teaching elementary grades in Palawan, but enough of the underlying work is the same, the core of it, the actual business of figuring out where a child is and what they need next, that we had more to say to each other than either of us expected when the conversations first started. About a year and a half into my time here, Grace mentioned that her school had a small library that was, in her words, in a state. Books that were disorganized, cataloging that was inconsistent, a space that was technically available to students, but not in any way that encouraged actual use. She mentioned it the way you mention something you've been thinking about without quite having the idea fully formed yet, the way students used to mention things to me when what they were really doing was discovering whether I was someone who'd take the idea seriously. I asked if she thought the school would welcome some help with it. She said she thought the principal might, if the offer were framed correctly. I said I had time. She said she would ask. The principal, a woman named Mrs. Tuazon, is a person who accomplishes what she accomplishes through a combination of organizational clarity and a quality I can only describe as the specific authority of someone who has never, not once in her professional life, had any patience for pretense. She met with me, asked direct questions about what I was proposing and what my actual qualifications were, and what I wanted in exchange for the time, and I gave her direct answers, told her about the teaching background, told her I wasn't after anything except something useful to do with mornings that were otherwise unscheduled, and she looked at me for a long moment in the way she apparently looks at everyone she's deciding about, and then she said, "Okay, Tuesday and Thursday, 8 in the morning, wear shoes you can stand in." That was 2.5 years ago. The library is now, genuinely, a different space, reorganized, properly cataloged with a system simple enough for the student librarians to maintain, a reading corner added with furniture that cost very little and was assembled with the help of Benji, who turns out to be unexpectedly skilled at carpentry and who took the project on as an extension of the neighborly relationship in a way that made me understand, the day the corner bookshelf went up, that community isn't actually a thing you join, it's a thing you build incrementally through exactly this kind of accumulated mutual investment. The students use the library now. I want to say that plainly because it's the thing I'm most proud of in the whole project, more than the cataloging, more than the furniture, more than the curated reading lists I developed for each grade level. The students use the library because it became a place that felt worth using, and the Tuesday and Thursday mornings when I come in and find 4 or 5 kids reading in that corner before school officially starts are, without competition, the best part of my week. There's a girl named Anna, 11 years old, who reads with an intensity I recognize from my best students in California, the kind of reader who goes somewhere else entirely when a book has her. Unreachable, sealed inside it in the way only people who fully understood what books actually are get to be. I've been quietly making sure the books she wants are there when she comes looking for them, on topics she's circled back to, on authors she's discovered and then wants more of, and I've started leaving her small notes tucked inside the books, just suggestions, just other directions she might want to go from wherever she currently is. She leaves notes back now, inside the books when she returns them, her observations, her arguments with characters, her disagreements with how things turned out. The whole thing is conducted entirely in marginalia and returned volumes, and it is one of the most satisfying conversations I've had in 4 years, which is saying something given that we've never once had it out loud. Afternoons here have a different quality than mornings. The heat is at its full weight by midday, and the town quiets in response the way towns built in tropical climates tend to quiet, not lazily, but practically, the way any sensible system adapts to its conditions. I've learned to honor this rhythm rather than work against it. I cook lunch at home most days, which was not something I did in Sacramento with any regularity, 31 years of teaching having converted my relationship to weekday lunch into a pragmatic rather than pleasurable exercise. Here I cook lunch properly, and the process of actually cooking, of going to the market in the morning with a rough idea of what I want, and then adjusting the plan based on what's there, has become one of the more grounding parts of my daily life, in a way I genuinely didn't see coming. Arnell's influence is visible in what I cook, I'll admit that. I've learned preparations I didn't know before, techniques for fresh fish that Sacramento had no reason to teach me, and I've adapted them, the way you adapt everything over time, into a version of cooking that is mine, without being quite traditionally Filipino, a hybrid that Marites tasted once and described as very okay for a teacher, which from Marites I understood to be high praise. I rest in the early afternoon because the heat invites it, and I've stopped feeling any particular need to resist the invitation. I used to feel guilty about this in the first year, an artifact of 31 years of 550 alarms and the particular Protestant productivity ethic of Northern California that says, rest is what you do after you've earned it, and not a moment before. I've let that go. Rest in the afternoon, real rest, is a reasonable response to an afternoon that is genuinely hot, and I'm 67, and I've been productive for long enough that I don't require anyone's permission to stop for an hour, including my own. Late afternoons belong to the water, usually. Not always swimming, not every day, though I swim more than I ever did in Sacramento, where swimming was a scheduled fitness activity rather than a thing you did because the sea was there, and it was warm, and the light on it at 4 p.m. was the color of something very old and very clean. I walk the beach most days, the stretch near the town that doesn't get the heavy tourist traffic in the late afternoon hours, and I've been doing it long enough now that the beach itself has become what I can only call familiar in the deepest sense. Not just recognized but known, the way you know a thing you've returned to 1,000 times. Its particular sounds and its particular quality of light at different hours, and the way the limestone formations at the far end catch the late afternoon sun differently in different seasons. I've met most of the people I consider actual friends through this end of afternoon hour. There's a woman named Dolores who is 63 years old and who has lived in El Nido her whole life, and who walks the same stretch most afternoons because she says it's where she does her best thinking, and we began walking together sometime in my second year when the coincidence of the same route at the same hour became comfortable enough to turn into a rhythm. Dolores knows things about the town that can't be learned from reading about it, the kind of knowledge that lives only in people who were born into a place, and she shares it the way people share things with someone they've decided is genuinely curious, rather than just being politely social. I have learned more from those late afternoon walks about the actual lived texture of this part of the Philippines than from everything I read before I came, which is, I think, the expected relationship between books and living, but which I still find worth acknowledging. There's also Paul, a 68-year-old retired graphic designer from the Netherlands who has been in El Nido for 6 years and who is the most efficient person I've ever met. Efficient in the sense that he never wastes energy on things he doesn't find worthwhile and doesn't apologize for this in the least, which I find deeply refreshing after 31 years in an institution where the performance of engagement was sometimes valued above the actual thing. Paul and I have dinner together on Friday evenings, almost without exception over the last 3 years, either at a small restaurant near the harbor that does an excellent grilled fish, or at one of our respective houses, and these Friday evenings have become something I look forward to with the specific anticipation I used to reserve for things that required more planning and ceremony. They require nothing except showing up, which turns out to be what the best things require. Paul was the person who sat with me the night I had a genuinely hard week, a stretch in my second year when several things went wrong in quick succession, the bureaucratic complication of the visa renewal process hitting a snag I hadn't anticipated, a health issue that turned out to be minor, but that required tests and waiting, and the particular anxiety that waiting for test results produces in a person who is 65 years old and has been paying attention to the actuarial tables, and, underneath both of those, an accumulation of the specific loneliness that comes not from the absence of people, but from the absence of people who've known you long enough to know what you're like when nothing is wrong. Paul showed up on a Thursday that week, unannounced, with a bottle of wine he'd been saving for something, he said, and this seemed like something, and we sat on my back porch until the mosquitoes made staying outside impractical, and then we moved inside and kept talking, and he told me, somewhere in the second glass,